Hey guys, tonight we begin with something really soothing. I know, you've probably had a long day. Maybe you scrolled a bit too much. Maybe you ate way too much late night biryani. No judgment. But now you're here, lights are dimmed, headphones in, ready for some boring history that will hopefully knock you out cold before we even get to the British opium factories, which honestly is probably the best way to consume this material. Because if you were awake through all of it in real life back then, well, you'd probably end up addicted, diseased, or broke. So, welcome. Tonight we're floating to colonial Calcutta, the so-called City of Palaces, which in theory sounds glamorous. Marble, columns, whitewashed bungalows, a little slice of Europe awkwardly dropped into Bengal. But in reality, think of a place where rich merchants were smoking cigars in chandeliers and chutney mansions, while just a few streets away, raw sewage mixed with cholera spores, and thousands of people were forced to grow poppies instead of rice. Ah yes, luxury for a few, diarrhea for the many. Classic empire vibes. Now, if you've ever wondered why Britain was so obsessed with making everyone in the 19th century either very high or very sick, this is your bedtime story. Spoiler alert, money. Always money. And Calcutta was basically the piggy bank. But before we dive into the rivers of opium and, well, less appealing fluids, let's set the stage. It's the late 18th and early 19th century. The East India Company, those guys with more power than most actual governments, is running Bengal like it's their personal startup. Only instead of delivering packages, they're delivering narcotics on a scale that would make modern cartels blush. Picture Calcutta around this time. Wide avenues with grand colonial houses, big gardens with banyan trees, and on the other side, cramped, sweltering neighborhoods with people packed tighter than the opium bricks headed to Canton. Europeans strolled with parasols, sipping gin, pretending they'd recreated London in the tropics. Except, with palm trees, malaria, and the occasional monkey stealing your breakfast. And beneath all this elegance floated two invisible forces. One made of smoke, opium, the drug that kept profits flowing. The other made of water, cholera, the disease that flowed wherever humans were too poor to get clean drinking water. Together, they shaped the fate of the city, and honestly, much of the world. Now, here's the irony. The same colonial system that forced farmers into opium production also left them malnourished and weakened, perfect targets for every disease outbreak, because why not double down on suffering? That was basically the company motto. All right, let's drift into the first layer of this story. Because yes, before we get to the cholera-infested drains, we need to talk about flowers. So, poppy plants. They look pretty, right? Bright petals, delicate stems, the kind of thing you'd expect in a cottage garden, maybe next to some lavender. Except in Bengal, these flowers weren't there to decorate your front yard. Nope. They were industrial. Imagine entire fields of them stretching across Bihar and Bengal, guarded, inspected, and destined for a very specific purpose. And no, not local use. The farmers themselves weren't allowed to enjoy the relaxing benefits. You see, the East India Company had a whole system. They basically said, "Hi there, peasants. We know you used to grow rice, the thing you actually eat, but we've decided you're going to grow opium instead. Don't worry, you'll be paid, in theory. And if you resist, well, let's just say you won't resist long." And so it went. Food crops were pushed aside, Families had less to eat, but the poppy plants bloomed. Their sap collected, processed in giant opium factories in places like Patna and Ghazipur, and then it all funneled through Calcutta, where it was packed, shipped, and sent off, mostly to Canton. Because Britain had a problem. They really, really liked tea, and they didn't have anything the Chinese wanted in return, except, of course, a little special product to get people hooked. So, opium was the answer. It was the addictive bridge between British cravings for tea and Chinese markets. Calcutta was the export hub, the beating heart of this narcotic pipeline. And the profits? Astronomical. They funded mansions, clubs, and a very smug colonial elite who pretended they were civilizing the world while literally selling drugs to millions of people. And while all this was happening, let's not forget the farmers back home. Malnourished, overworked, indebted, entire villages slipping deeper into poverty, which, by the way, made them extremely vulnerable to, you guessed it, cholera. But we'll float to that plague in a little while. Now, let's pause for a second, because I know what you're thinking. Wow, this is depressing. And yes, it is. But remember, this is bedtime history. The slower and sadder, the better for your sleep. So just picture the scene in slow motion, ships creaking at the Calcutta docks, crates of opium being loaded with casual efficiency, while on the other side of town, families boiled whatever scraps they had left into watery rice gruel. A quiet tragedy packaged neatly for global trade. And of course, the British officials overseeing all this weren't exactly losing sleep. They were busy founding clubs, debating politics, and attending dances. Calcutta was sometimes called the second city of the empire, right after London. And if you squinted, maybe you could almost believe it. Marble halls, music, chandeliers. Meanwhile, outside, stagnant ponds, clogged drains, and mosquitoes humming their nightly songs. A paradise for epidemics. And that brings us to the second invisible force, cholera. Now, cholera is not a glamorous disease. In fact, it's one of the least glamorous things possible. And unfortunately, Calcutta in the 19th century was its favorite playground. The city's population was growing fast. Rural migrants came looking for work, only to end up in cramped slums with no clean water, no sanitation, and very little protection. Perfect conditions for a waterborne disease. And cholera thrived. The first officially recognized pandemics of cholera started right here in Bengal, spreading outward with terrifying ease. Soldiers, traders, pilgrims, all carried it beyond India, across Asia, into Europe, Africa, even America. In fact, if you've ever read old history books referring to Asiatic cholera, that's basically code for it started in Calcutta and then everyone else got sick. But before we dive deeper into that messy subject, let's take a little float back to the ironies of empire. Because the same colonial city that exported opium smoke was also exporting cholera spores. Two global flows, one profitable, the other disastrous, and both centered on the same unlucky place. So let's keep drifting. We'll go deeper into the cholera outbreaks next and how they shaped not just Calcutta, but modern medicine itself. But for now, remember the scene. The palaces on Chwarringi Road, the stinking drains just a block away, and somewhere in the distance, ships carrying crates of drugs and, unintentionally, the seeds of the next great pandemic. And yes, this is only the beginning.
All right, so now that we've gotten cozy with the poppies and the company men getting rich off them, let's slowly, carefully, move over to the less glamorous side of colonial Calcutta. And by less glamorous, I mean sewage, buckets of it. Because what is history without a little bit of human misery mixed into the drains? Let's talk cholera. Now, I don't know what comes to mind when you hear the word cholera, but let me paint you a picture. A disease that basically turns your digestive system into a fast-flowing water pump. Very fast, very fatal, and very, very common in 19th century Calcutta. Romantic, right? And why Calcutta? Well, let's think about it. Imagine a rapidly growing colonial city filled with soldiers, clerks, and merchants. Add in thousands of laborers and migrants crammed into tiny huts, drinking from the same water source they bathed in, and sometimes, yes, also used as a toilet. Sprinkle in some tropical heat, stagnant ponds, and mosquitoes for good measure. Congratulations, you've invented the perfect epidemiological soup. And cholera absolutely loved it. The first major recorded outbreak started here around the early 1800s. But calling it outbreaks is a bit misleading. Cholera in Bengal wasn't really a visitor. It was a permanent resident. It was like that uninvited relative who shows up at every wedding, funeral, and dinner party, no matter how much you try to ignore them. For the colonial authorities, this was awkward. On one hand, they were trying to sell Calcutta as a shining example of British order and progress. Look, we have marble palaces. Look, we have cricket clubs. Look, we've brought civilization. And yet, at the same time, ships were leaving the very same city carrying cholera across the seas. Civilization indeed. Now, let's drift for a moment into the everyday experience. Because for ordinary people living in Calcutta's overcrowded neighborhoods, cholera wasn't a medical curiosity. It was a daily fear. Imagine you wake up in the morning, fetch some water from the local tank, and by nightfall, half your household could be gone. Death was quick, sometimes within hours. Families didn't even have time to process what was happening before they were digging graves, or in many cases, unable to dig them fast enough. But let's not get too dramatic. Remember, this is boring history, so picture it in slow motion. Streets with wooden carts carrying the sick, doctors fumbling with ineffective remedies, neighbors whispering superstitions about angry gods or poisoned wells, and above all, the resigned acceptance that disease was simply part of urban life. Of course, the British and their grand houses weren't immune either. They had servants boiling their water, filtering it through cloth, even adding brandy for medicinal purposes. But cholera didn't exactly respect class lines. It slipped quietly into barracks, into government offices, even into the governor's mansion, because sometimes sewage doesn't care about your social rank. Now, here's where it gets global. Calcutta wasn't just a city, it was a hub. Ships came in, ships went out. Soldiers rotated, pilgrims traveled, goods circulated. And with them went the tiny bacteria that cause cholera. You couldn't see them, of course. This was long before germ theory was widely accepted. But the disease traveled anyway, hitching rides on riverboats, trains, and ocean liners. This is why, by the 1820s and 1830s, cholera pandemics were literally circling the globe. From India to Russia, from Russia to Europe, and from Europe across the Atlantic. Every time people tried to track its origins, the singer pointed back to Bengal, which gave rise to the name Asiatic cholera. Subtle, isn't it? Nothing like blaming an entire continent for what was really a global trade issue. And if you're wondering what the colonial officials were doing about all this, well, mostly panicking and writing reports. There were attempts at sanitation reform. Committees met, papers were filed, recommendations were made. and then promptly ignored, underfunded, or abandoned. Because remember, building a proper sewage system costs money. Forcing peasants to grow poppies, on the other hand, makes money. Guess which one the company preferred? Let's pause here for a little dry humor because we need it. One British observer in the 1830s described Calcutta's drainage system as sufficient only for carrying filth from one part of the city to another, which is honestly a poetic way of saying, congratulations, you've built the world's first cholera delivery service. And yet, through all of this, colonial society carried on. Theaters opened, balls were held, officers played polo. People died, of course, but there were always replacements arriving on the next ship from Britain. Life and death were just part of the imperial rhythm. Now, if you've been keeping track, you'll notice a pattern. On one side of Bengal, farmers were trapped in the cycle of opium cultivation, hungry, weak, and poor. On the other side, cities like Calcutta were drowning in cholera outbreaks. And in between, a ruling elite that was profiting massively from one and doing almost nothing about the other. It's almost as if the empire was a giant machine for squeezing wealth out of human misery. But very elegantly with marble statues and military parades. And here's a little ironic twist. The very global connections that made opium such a lucrative export also made cholera a global pandemic. The same shipping routes, the same trade networks. One product made fortunes, the other spread fear. Together, they turned Calcutta into both a treasure chest and a medical nightmare. And of course, as cholera spread, so did curiosity. Doctors and scientists began to take notice. They didn't understand bacteria yet, but they noticed patterns. Some thought it was bad air. Miasma theory was still popular. Others suspected water. A few sharp observers even proposed that contaminated water sources were the culprit. But like all good colonial committees, agreement took decades. In the meantime, millions died. And if you're wondering what people did to protect themselves, well, the list of remedies is both tragic and amusing. Some swore by opium tinctures, because of course they did. Why not treat a disease caused by contaminated water with a drug that the company was mass producing? Others tried calomel, a mercury compound, which was about as effective as it sounds. Some just drank brandy, which honestly might have been the most pleasant option, if not the most effective. Let's float back to the human side for a moment. Imagine a Bengali laborer in the 1820s. His family fields no longer grow rice, they're filled with poppies. His children are underfed. His drinking water comes from a tank where waste is also dumped. He hears of neighbors dying suddenly, violently. He prays, but nothing changes. This was daily life under empire. A quiet, grinding disaster, never glamorous enough to make it into the paintings of colonial mansions, but always there in the background. And now, think of a British merchant on the same day. He's sitting in his veranda, sipping gin and tonic, congratulating himself on another profitable opium shipment. He complains about the humidity, maybe about the smell wafting from the poorer quarters, and then perhaps he gets a stomachache that evening. The disease didn't discriminate as much as he did. That's the atmosphere we're drifting through. Wealth and misery, side by side, opium smoke and cholera water shaping a city and its place in the world. So where does this leave us? Well, by the mid-19th century, cholera had firmly established itself as a global terror. Opium was firmly established as a global business. And Calcutta, our so-called city of palaces, was the crossroads of both. But don't worry, we're not done. We'll float next into how these twin forces, opium profits and cholera deaths, intertwined with medicine, politics, and everyday life. And yes, it's going to stay boring enough to keep you nicely drowsy. So close your eyes if you haven't already, and picture once again the colonial city. Grand mansions lit by candlelight, narrow alleys filled with sickness, and ships on the Hooghly River carrying both wealth and death out into the wider world.
So, now that we've established that Calcutta was basically an open-air laboratory for both narcotics and waterborne disease, let's slowly wade into another layer of this story: colonial medicine. Or, to be more accurate, colonial attempts at medicine. Picture the scene. Cholera outbreaks were sweeping the city, people were dying in droves, and the authorities, well, they decided to hold a few meetings. Because nothing says public health crisis like forming a committee and drafting a 200-page report that nobody reads. The quackery years. Let's begin with treatments. In the early 1800s, medicine was still in what we might generously call the try-anything phase. Doctors didn't really know what cholera was, but they knew it was terrifying, so they threw the kitchen sink at it. Some prescribed calomel, a mercury-based compound. Yes, mercury, the thing that makes thermometers shiny and slowly kills you. The idea was that it would purge the body of disease. In reality, it purged patients of their teeth, their hair, and eventually their lives. Effective? Not really, but it gave doctors something to do while patients died anyway. Comforting, I suppose, if not exactly life-saving. And then there were the home remedies. Vinegar baths, mustard plasters, bleeding. Because if you're already losing liters of fluid an hour, surely the best idea is to train a little more, right? Quarantine, or theatrical inconvenience. By the mid-19th century, cholera was spreading so reliably out of Bengal that foreign governments started to panic. Quarantine measures were introduced. Ships were inspected, passengers detained, ports sometimes closed. But here's the problem. Trade was profitable. Quarantine was not. So every rule had a loophole, every measure was half-hearted, and cholera slipped through again and again. In Calcutta itself, efforts were made to clean up the city. Committees recommended better drains, piped water, proper burial grounds, but somehow the funds always went elsewhere. To a new theater, perhaps, or another monument to imperial grandeur. Building sewers simply wasn't as glamorous as building statues of Queen Victoria. And the result? Calcutta kept its reputation as one of the most unhealthy major cities in the world, which is saying something considering Victorian London had its own fair share of human waste floating in the Thames. The opium versus cholera economy. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger irony. On one side, you had the opium trade pouring unimaginable wealth into colonial coffers. British merchants were dining in lavish mansions along Chirangi Road, building clubs where they could sip brandy and talk about profits. On the other side, you had cholera quietly eroding the city's population, draining families of their breadwinners, leaving behind orphans and widows. It was wealth and poverty, health and sickness, side by side. And the same system that enforced opium cultivation actively deepened the misery. Villagers deprived of rice were more vulnerable to disease. Migrants flocking to Calcutta for work ended up in overcrowded, unsanitary quarters. The conditions that made cholera so deadly were not accidents.
they were consequences. It's almost like the empire was running a bizarre experiment. How much profit can we extract before the entire population collapses? Spoiler, quite a lot. Scientific progress, very slowly. Now, to be fair, cholera did eventually push medicine forward. As outbreaks spread across the world, doctors and scientists began studying patterns. In London, John Snow, not the you-know-nothing one, the other one, famously identified contaminated water as the source of cholera in the 1850s. His famous Broad Street pump case became a cornerstone of modern epidemiology. But back in Calcutta, long before germ theory was universally accepted, many still clung to miasma theory, the idea that bad air caused disease, which, in fairness, wasn't entirely irrational given how foul the air in Calcutta could be. Walk through a slum where sewage, garbage, and bodies lay together, and yes, the air probably did feel deadly. It just wasn't the real culprit. The irony, by the term germ theory gained traction, millions had already died. Cholera outbreaks became one of the world's first true pandemics, reminding everyone that global trade didn't just move tea and opium, it also moved microbes. Calcutta as a case study. So what was Calcutta's role in all this? It became both villain and victim. Villain because it was the epicenter from which cholera spread outward, earning it the grim nickname Home of Cholera. Victim because its own residents bore the brunt of the suffering, especially those at the bottom of the colonial hierarchy. If you lived in the palatial quarters, cholera was an inconvenience. If you lived in the slums, it was a death sentence. The divide was so stark that contemporary observers often commented on the surreal contrast: candlelit balls on one street, funeral pyres on the next. And all the while, empire colonial. Opium wealth kept flowing. In fact, the company's revenue from opium was sometimes explicitly used to cover the cost of dealing with disease outbreaks and famines. It was a cycle. Profits from addiction funding half-hearted responses to epidemics. A grim balance sheet if there was ever one. Everyday life in a sick city. Let's slow down here and drift through daily life again. Imagine the average European merchant waking up in his spacious bungalow. He calls for tea, grown in Assam, sweetened with sugar from the Caribbean, served by Indian servants. Outside, the streets are already bustling. Rickshaw pullers, hawkers, porters. He might notice a funeral procession passing, but it hardly registers. Death is constant. Now, shift to the Bengali laborer in the same city. His day begins at dawn. He walks to the docks or the warehouses, hungry, already tired. The water he drinks is cloudy, but it's all he has. His neighbor fell ill the night before. By evening, he hears that the neighbor is gone. Life moves on. Work must go on. There are mouths to feed, debts to pay, and always, somewhere in the distance, ships are loading crates of opium bound for China. This was the rhythm of colonial Calcutta. Wealth, el-Izari layered together like mismatched wallpaper. One group profiting from global trade, another group bearing the cost in sickness and death. A city between extremes. By the mid-19th century, Calcutta had become a city of extremes. On one end, theaters, race courses, cricket clubs, elegant government buildings. On the other, cholera outbreaks so severe that entire neighborhoods were left half empty. British elites continued to call it the City of Palaces, but travelers often remarked on the smell, the heat, the death. One observer described Calcutta as a city where luxury sits beside destitution and death lurks in every tank of water, which is basically the colonial version of a one-star Yelp review. And through it all, the empire persisted. Profits kept rising, opium kept moving, cholera kept killing. Nothing was solved, but everything was sustained, like a grim equilibrium. So as we close this part of our sleepy journey, picture Calcutta once again in slow focus. Grand buildings glowing with oil lamps, carriages rolling along wide avenues, while in the shadows, the less fortunate huddled against disease and hunger. The river carried ships outward, some loaded with opium bricks, others unknowingly carrying cholera bacteria to the next continent.
So far, we've lingered in Calcutta's back alleys, drains, and drawing rooms. We've seen the city as a stage where opium riches glittered, while cholera quietly took center stage. But the story doesn't stop at the Hooghly River. Oh no, because Calcutta wasn't just a city. It was a launch pad. And what did it launch? Well, depending on your luck, either narcotics or disease. Sometimes both. Let's start with a simple observation. Ships were the internet of the 19th century. They connected the world, carried ideas, people, and goods across oceans. They also carried germs, a lot of germs. And in the case of cholera, they carried a particularly efficient one. From Calcutta to the world. The first major cholera pandemic began around 1817. Where? You guessed it, Bengal. The disease had been around locally for centuries, but this time the conditions were perfect for global travel. Troop movements, pilgrimages, trade routes, all spreading out from the same congested, unsanitary hub. So, cholera hitched a ride, down the Ganges, across India, then outward. By the 1820s, it was in Southeast Asia. By the 1830s, it had reached Russia and Europe. By the 1840s, it was knocking on doors in North America. All the while, people were asking, where on earth did this come from? And the answer kept circling back to Calcutta. This was how the city earned its grim reputation as the home of cholera. Not the kind of branding you'd put on a tourism poster, but effective nonetheless. Imagine the brochures. Come to Calcutta, where you'll find palaces, poppies, and a complimentary case of Asiatic cholera. The blame game. Of course, blaming was easier than solving. European writers were quick to paint cholera as an Asiatic problem. The East, they said, was inherently diseased, filthy, backward. Calcutta became a kind of shorthand for everything that scared Westerners about the tropics: heat, death, and mysterious illnesses. Never mind that the disease spread because of global trade networks, the very networks run by Europeans. It was easier and far more convenient to blame the geography, the climate, or better yet, the people. Racism mixed smoothly with bad science. Doctors wrote reports linking cholera to Oriental habits or native negligence, as if poverty and overcrowding were lifestyle choices rather than colonial consequences. Meanwhile, the colonial authorities in Calcutta liked to point fingers outward, too. If an outbreak got particularly bad, they blamed migrants, pilgrims, or even the city's geography. Anything except their own negligence in sanitation. After all, drains and clean water didn't exactly bring in revenue the way opium did. Pilgrims and pandemics. One of the most efficient carriers of cholera was pilgrimage. Bengal and India more broadly was full of sacred sites that drew huge crowds. Pilgrims gathered, drank from local tanks, and then dispersed back to their villages, sometimes carrying the disease with them. From a microbe's perspective, this was basically free Uber service. The British response was occasionally ban or restrict pilgrimages, which went about as you'd expect. People didn't stop traveling for faith just because a colonial officer said so. And even when restrictions were enforced, they often created resentment rather than results. Another efficient carrier was, of course, the army. British and Indian troops marched across the subcontinent, bringing with them not just muskets, but microbes. If the empire was a machine, its soldiers were both its gears and its disease vectors. Cholera on tour. By the mid-19th century, cholera had gone global. In Europe, it caused sheer panic. Cities unaccustomed to such fast-moving, brutal disease scrambled to respond. Quarantines were attempted, sanitation reform slowly introduced, and always in the background was the whisper. It came from Calcutta. Imagine the headlines if there had been newspapers like ours. Breaking, Asiatic cholera sweeps Europe, blame the tropics. Never mind that it was global shipping, colonial expansion, and industrial overcrowding that made it possible. The narrative was set. And in a way, Calcutta became infamous without even trying. A city thousands of miles away, described in lurid detail in European accounts as the breeding grounds of plague. It was a reputation that stuck for decades. The colonial image problem. For the British elite living in Calcutta, this was inconvenient. On the one hand, they wanted to present the city as a jewel of empire, the second city after London. On the other, everyone associated it with disease, not exactly good PR. So, what did they do? Well, they doubled down on the palaces, the clubs, the theaters. If you couldn't fix the drains, at least you could distract visitors with marble. It was like spraying perfume in a room full of garbage. Better than nothing, but the smell lingered. Visitors often wrote about this surreal contrast, a glittering ball one night, a cholera outbreak the next morning. For some, this became part of the city's strange allure. For others, it was simply proof that empire was a dangerous game. Wealth and Woe, Export Edition. Here's the irony again. At the exact same time that cholera was spreading misery across continents, opium was spreading profit. The very same docks that shipped crates of narcotics to Canton were also sending infected sailors and passengers around the globe. 2 exports, 1 city. One made fortunes, the other made funerals. And both were sustained by the same colonial indifference. If people were dying in the slums, replaceable. If peasants were starving in the countryside, replaceable. As long as the ships kept sailing and the revenue kept flowing, the system remained intact. A sleepy thought experiment. Now, because this is boring history, let's slow down and imagine a single ship leaving Calcutta in, say, 1832. On the deck, crates of opium neatly stamped and sealed. Below deck, sailors, some of them already ill. In the water barrels, bacteria, invisible to the human eye. The ship sails east to China, west to Europe, maybe around Africa. Everywhere it goes, it spreads both profit and plague. Multiply that by dozens, hundreds of ships over decades, and you begin to see how one city could alter global health history. Calcutta wasn't just a dot on the map, it was a hub in a deadly network. Calcutta's reputation solidified. By the late 19th century, cholera pandemics were so regular that they became almost routine. Scientists gathered in international conferences to debate causes and cures. Governments argued about quarantine laws. Cities invested, slowly, in sewage systems. And always, in the background, was the whisper. It came from Calcutta. So, as we close this part of the story, picture once again the contradictions. Opium warehouses stacked with wealth, cholera wards stacked with bodies, British officials in grand uniforms, Bengali families carrying water from contaminated tanks, ships sailing off proudly from the Hooghly, carrying not just goods, but global pandemics. That was Calcutta's dual legacy. A city of riches and ruins, admired and feared, exporting both dreams and nightmares. So, now that we've seen Calcutta as a global hub for opium profits and cholera deaths, let's gently float into the human side of things. Because history isn't just dates, pandemics, or trade routes. It's also people. People who were rich, people who were poor, and everyone awkwardly squeezed in between. The Gentlemen of Chowringhee. Let's start at the top. Imagine the British elite in Calcutta. Spacious bungalows, manicured gardens, chandeliers reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun, servants moving silently in the background. They spent their mornings discussing tea prices, afternoons drinking gin, and evenings hosting balls. Very civilized, very proper. Some of them were obsessed with fashion, waistcoats, cravats, polished boots, because nothing says colonial authority like dressing up while your city is slowly dying. They kept diaries, wrote letters home describing the charming chaos of Calcutta, occasionally noting that cholera was sweeping through the lower classes, but only occasionally. After all, it's hard to focus on the dead when you're planning a masquerade. And then there was opium. The merchants, company officials, and doctors often had easy access. It was used for relaxation, medicinal purposes, or simply to help pass the long, humid afternoons. Some drank tinctures as if they were tea. Others smoked. Some became quietly addicted, though of course in polite society, addiction was referred to as a mild enjoyment or habitual use. Their lives were orderly, predictable, and insulated. Death was distant, until it wasn't. Occasionally an outbreak would claim one of their servants, or in rare cases a family member. Then they'd retreat behind curtains, burn a little incense, and resume dancing the next evening. It's a strange, almost surreal rhythm, glamour and tragedy side by side. The laborers of the slums. Now, let's float across the city to the opposite end of the spectrum. Streets narrower than the alleys in London slums, huts packed with families, and open drains carrying what you probably don't want to imagine. The majority of the population had no luxury of leisure, no soft beds, no gin to dull the anxiety. Most of these people were tied into the opium economy, whether they liked it or not. Farmers in the countryside grew poppies instead of rice, often under coercion. Their families struggled with food scarcity, and malnutrition made them more vulnerable to disease. When cholera arrived, it hit like a hammer. Deaths were sudden, leaving children orphaned, families destitute, and neighborhoods in mourning. Yet, life went on. People adapted. Those who survived developed routines to minimize risk, boiling water when possible, avoiding certain wells, or simply accepting the inevitability. Religion and superstition offered comfort. Some families performed rituals to appease local spirits, believing it might ward off the disease. Others relied on small home remedies, a pinch of salt, an herbal decoction, or a bit of opium if they could manage it. And yet, day after day, the contrast with the elite was jarring. While one family mourned in silence, Just a few streets away, merchants laughed over tea and cigars. The city was a constant reminder that wealth and poverty were not just economic, they were existential. Children of empire. Now, if you really want to drift into melancholy, let's consider the children. Both European and Indian children grew up in this environment, but their experiences were worlds apart. European children often had nannies, tutors, and clean water. They played in gardens, wore neatly pressed clothes, and were occasionally warned not to touch native water or stray into the alleys where cholera might be lurking. Of course, this didn't make them immune. Cholera sometimes claimed young members of elite families, but the odds were better. Indian children, on the other hand, had to navigate a much harsher reality. Many worked from a young age, helping in markets, on docks, or in the opium fields. Malnutrition, exposure to disease, and the constant threat of cholera made childhood precarious. Fun was rare, and survival was often the main goal. And here's a small, subtle tragedy. Many of these children would grow up watching the wealth they helped sustain swirl around them like smoke, completely out of reach. It's a city of contrast, layered not just by wealth and poverty, but by age, opportunity, and luck. Quirks and oddities. Even in such grim conditions, life had quirks. For example, the British obsession with social clubs often collided with the chaos outside their walls. Some clubs insisted on formal dress codes, while cholera claimed hundreds just outside the gates. Others debated poetry, politics, or the quality of imported tea, while water tanks nearby were probably contaminated. The elites also had strange hobbies to cope with the heat and humidity. Betting on horse races, keeping tropical birds, attending fancy dress balls, little distractions from the fact that the city itself was, statistically speaking, dangerous to live in. Meanwhile, some Bengali elites tried to emulate British habits, hosting small salons, adopting European clothing, or sending children to British-run schools. But they also faced the reality that wealth didn't make them immune to disease, especially when sanitation was so poor. And so, the city remained a jumble of imitated manners, local traditions, and daily survival. Daily rhythms of survival. Let's float through a single day in slow motion. A laborer wakes at dawn, collects water, and prepares a small meal. Children run errands. The elderly watch, quietly worried. Meanwhile, ships at the dock are loaded with opium bricks. Merchants sip tea. Soldiers march through the streets, some carrying cholera unknowingly. The city hums along, a weird combination of industriousness, routine, and quiet dread. And by mid-afternoon, the heat is oppressive. Some people retreat to shade. Some keep working. In the alleys, small outbreaks occur quietly. Families fall ill. Deaths happen without notice. A funeral pyre here, a whispered prayer there. By evening, the wealthy host a ball. The servants cook, the city breathes, and life continues. And this is the rhythm of Calcutta. The mundane mixed with the tragic, the ordinary mixed with the catastrophic, all layered gently together like sediment in a river. It's slow, it's quiet, and it's endlessly fascinating if you're the kind of person who finds quiet misery absorbing instead of horrifying. Opium as emotional escape. And let's not forget opium in everyday life. For the elite, it was leisure. For some locals, it was an occasional escape from hunger or sickness. Opium dens appeared, mostly discreetly, often in narrow lanes or quieter quarters. They were small, smoky rooms where people would lie down, smoke, or drink tincture, and try to forget the heat, the hunger, the disease, the constant tension of life under colonial rule. It was never glamorous, but it worked. Or at least it seemed to. Sleep came easier, if temporarily, for some. And in a city that never really offered safety, distraction became a coping mechanism. A city of quiet contrast. So, as we gently glide to the end of this part, picture Calcutta one last time before we rest. Marble palaces and narrow alleys, opium smoke drifting over stinking water tanks, laughter from ballroom windows contrasting with quiet mourning in the slums, ships on the Hooghly, carrying both bricks of narcotics and human disease across the globe. It's a city of contrast. It's a city of subtle ironies, and it's exactly the kind of city you can imagine in slow motion, perfect for letting your mind float toward sleep. Wealth, disease, survival, and ritual all moving together in gentle, inexorable rhythms.
So far, we've wandered through Calcutta's streets, glimpsed the glittering lives of elites, and shivered at the quiet tragedy of ordinary residents. Now, let's drift into something slightly more structured. Colonial medicine in practice. Hospitals, doctors, experiments, and the gentle, persistent incompetence that comes with governing a city built on opium profits and human misery. The early colonial hospitals. By the early 19th century, the British realized, finally, that perhaps, just perhaps, having a city where people dropped dead in droves wasn't ideal. So hospitals were built. Not out of altruism, of course, but because a healthy workforce ensured trade and military operations continued. There's nothing quite like a death toll to motivate bureaucracy. Hospitals were initially simple affairs, one-story buildings, poorly ventilated, filled with cots, patients, and an atmosphere that smelled vaguely of vinegar and despair. Doctors patrolled the wards, often inexperienced, often untrained in tropical diseases. Medicine was still in its experimental phase, so treatments varied wildly. Patients were typically Indian laborers, soldiers, and occasionally British seamen. Wealthy Europeans often preferred private care, which usually involved an extra dose of opium and a cooler room. But for the average person, the hospital was both a place of hope and a grim reminder of how little protection the colonial system offered. Doctors with gentle theories. At this time, the debate over what caused cholera was in full swing. Some doctors adhered to the miasma theory, the idea that bad air caused disease. Walk into a slum with open drains, and yes, the air smells terrible. Naturally, this seemed like a convincing culprit. Others suspected water contamination. A few sharp observers noticed that outbreaks clustered around certain tanks and wells. But admitting this meant addressing the real problem, public infrastructure, which required money. And as we know, money was better spent on opium and palaces. So the result was a compromise. Doctors wrote long reports, debated endlessly at meetings, recommended cleaning certain areas here and there, and everyone went back to their usual routines. Hospitals stayed understaffed, drains stayed clogged, and cholera continued its gentle, relentless march forward. The role of nurses and staff. The wards weren't run by doctors alone. Nurses, often local women or lower-class Europeans, played a vital role. They tended to patients, prepared medicines, cleaned floors, and whispered comfort when no medicine could help. Their lives were physically exhausting and emotionally draining. Imagine caring for dozens of patients, many of whom would not survive, while being paid very little and living in the same squalor that made the disease so deadly. Yet they persisted, quietly keeping the system functional. Some doctors, in rare moments of recognition, acknowledged their work. Most of the time, though, they remained invisible in official reports, which focused on treatments attempted and statistics recorded. Human effort, it seemed, was less important than paperwork. Tentative public health reforms. By the 1840s and 1850s, the British authorities realized that something more systemic might be necessary. Some minor reforms were introduced: digging new drains, relocating certain markets, introducing quarantine measures during outbreaks. Progress was slow. Often recommendations were made, funds were allocated, and then delays, corruption, or bureaucratic inertia ensured very little actually changed. In many cases, the measures were symbolic: a new public bath here, a fenced-out tank there, intended more to reassure observers than to genuinely protect the population. But there were glimmers of hope. Some hospitals improved sanitation. Some doctors experimented with isolation wards. Some European residents began advocating for cleaner water supplies. These were small victories in a city still dominated by the dual forces of opium and cholera. Epidemiology slowly emerging. One of the more interesting developments was the birth of epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread. British physicians stationed in Calcutta began meticulously recording cases, noting dates, locations, and potential causes. Patterns slowly emerged. Outbreaks often clustered near water sources. Pilgrimages and trade routes were linked to disease spread. This kind of data collection was revolutionary, even if the conclusions weren't fully understood yet. Doctors were like early detectives, piecing together clues from incomplete evidence. It's almost charming in its fumbling thoroughness. Handwritten logs, rough maps, and painstaking charts that sometimes led to correct conclusions, and sometimes didn't. Hospitals as social mirrors. Hospitals were also mirrors of society. The wealthy could pay for private treatment. The poor relied on public wards. British soldiers received preferential care. Indian laborers were treated if they were useful to the company. Everyone else, well, they were often left to the mercy of chance, home remedies, or community support. In this way, hospitals reflected the social hierarchy of Calcutta. They were microcosms of the city. Inequality, control, and colonial priorities all neatly displayed in rows of cots. And yet, amid the monotony of disease and death, small acts of care persisted. Nurses, attendants, and occasionally doctors offered comfort, tending to bodies and spirits alike. A gentle contrast. To illustrate the contrast once more, picture two simultaneous scenes. In a hospital ward, dozens of patients groaning quietly, treated with dubious remedies, nurses moving carefully between cots, a doctor scribbling observations in a notebook. Outside, in a nearby mansion, a wealthy official hosts a garden party, sipping chilled drinks, laughing, and discussing trade profits. Both scenes occur in the same city, same moment. One is intimate, painful, and messy. The other is calm, orderly, and indulgent. And yet, they are connected. The labor of the sick fuels the luxury of the elite. Opium and cholera, illness and profit, coexisting in a slow, inevitable rhythm. The human side of reform. Despite the limitations, some reforms had noticeable effects. Water tanks were sometimes cleaned, street drains cleared, pilgrimages occasionally regulated. These small improvements reduced the intensity of outbreaks, though never eliminated them. And perhaps, in a sleepy sense, that's the story of colonial Calcutta. Incremental progress amid persistent suffering. Doctors did what they could, sometimes well, sometimes poorly. Authorities funded some initiatives, ignored others, and people adapted, survived, or, tragically, did not. Reflection and slow motion. Let's end this part with a quiet thought. Imagine walking through Calcutta's wards at dusk. Patients lie quietly, some breathing heavily,
some sleeping. Outside, the city hums. Merchants close shop, boats glide on the river, opium smoke drifts into the evening air. Somewhere, children laugh. Somewhere, another funeral is prepared. Hospitals, reforms, and epidemiology. They are all attempts to bring order to chaos. Sometimes successful, often not. But they represent humanity's slow, tentative grappling with a city that was both thriving and crumbling, opulent and deadly all at once.
By now, we've wandered through Calcutta's streets, peeked into elite ballrooms, and spent time in its hospitals. But life in the city wasn't only about bricks, opium, and mortality statistics. It was also about beliefs, whispers, and quiet coping mechanisms. People needed ways to understand, explain, and sometimes ignore the invisible threat of cholera. The whispered explanations. When cholera struck, explanations abounded. Not all of them medical, not all of them accurate, but all meaningful to the people living through it. Some whispered that bad spirits had been angered. Others claimed that consuming certain foods or crossing into unholy neighborhoods could summon disease. There were rumors about infected merchants, poisoned wells, and cursed pilgrims. Some believed that certain astrologically unlucky days caused outbreaks. It's a bit like reading a conspiracy website today. Everyone had a theory, none of them scientifically correct, but all profoundly human. And while European elites rolled their eyes at such superstitions, local communities relied on them as practical tools. Rituals, prayers, and protective charms didn't cure cholera, of course, but they offered a sense of control in a world where disease struck suddenly and mercilessly. Rituals and remedies. In the Bengali households, daily life adjusted subtly but consistently. Families often carried small sachets of herbs or amulets. Water was boiled when possible, though fuel was scarce, so sometimes it wasn't. Fasting, incense, and prayers became part of survival strategy. One common ritual involved sprinkling a mixture of mustard seeds, turmeric, and cow urine around the home, intended to repel disease-carrying spirits. It probably didn't do much against bacteria, but it gave people a sense of agency. Agency, as it turns out, can be surprisingly comforting. Social networks as safety nets. Another coping mechanism was social networks. Neighbors watched out for each other. Extended families pooled resources. Religious institutions provided food, shelter, or advice. Even small gestures, like sharing a bit of clean water or tending to a sick neighbor, could be life-saving. The city's poor, in particular, developed routines for survival. Certain streets were avoided during outbreaks. People paid attention to which water sources were safe and which wells had earned a reputation for killing quietly. Patterns emerged, based on observation rather than science. In this way, the city's informal knowledge network became a primitive epidemiology, quietly mapping risk without doctors or charts. It was slow, imperfect, and based on rumor, but it worked well enough to guide survival. Elite reactions to rumors. Meanwhile, European elites often treated rumors with a mix of amusement and disdain. A British merchant might smirk at a neighbor performing a protective ritual, then return home and light his own opium pipe. Sometimes, they attempted to regulate the city's beliefs, especially if they interfered with trade or governance. Official proclamations would ban certain rituals in public spaces or enforce quarantine rules. But it was tricky. Interfere too much, and you risked alienating the local population. Ignore it, and disease continued unabated. In other words, the colonial authorities had to navigate a delicate balance between superstition and control, often failing spectacularly on both fronts. Children and daily life. Children, of course, adapted in their own ways. They learned which streets to avoid, how to fetch water safely, and which neighbors were reliable in a crisis. Play was muted, cautious, often taking place indoors or in quieter alleys. Yet even children found small joys. Spinning tops, kites, or quietly watching boats on the Hooghly offered temporary escape. These moments didn't prevent cholera, but they allowed life to feel normal, even if only briefly. Festivals in the time of cholera. One of the more surreal aspects of Calcutta life was how festivals continued amidst outbreaks. Religious celebrations, marriages, and cultural events didn't stop entirely. People found ways to celebrate carefully, sometimes modifying rituals, sometimes ignoring caution entirely. But the essential spirit of life persisted. Cholera was terrifying, but it didn't fully halt the human desire for ritual and connection. Humor and resilience. A quieter, slower coping mechanism was humor. Even in tragedy, people made jokes about their circumstances, often dark, sometimes ironic, but always whispered. A common quip among workers might be, "Better the river take me than the landlord's debt." Or a merchant might sigh, "Cholera waits for no man, but taxes do." This dry humor was a way of asserting some control, a small rebellion against the world that seemed indifferent. And in a city dominated by contrasts, palaces and slums, opium and disease, humor became as essential as food or water. Chronic anxiety, quiet adaptation. Over time, residents developed a slow, adaptive rhythm. They learned to read signs, anticipate outbreaks, and quietly modify routines. The city itself became a teacher. Lessons were written in experience, whispered in advice, remembered in ritual. Calcutta's daily life in this sense was a delicate dance. Avoid the obvious hazards, respect the invisible ones, maintain social connections, and find pockets of comfort whenever possible. Disease, poverty, and colonial oversight were constants, but humans are remarkably good at finding ways to exist alongside constants without collapsing entirely. A gentle reflection. As we drift towards the end of this part, picture the city at dusk. Narrow alleys glimmer with oil lamps, children return home from errands, families gather quietly, performing small protective rituals. Somewhere, a festival lamp glows. Somewhere else, a sick neighbor is tended with herbs and whispered prayers. In the distance, European elites walk along Chauringi, oblivious to the hardships mere streets away. Opium smoke curls lazily into the humid air. Boats glide gently on the Hooghly, carrying goods, letters, and the occasional unwitting carrier of disease. Life, in all its contrasts, continues. Slowly, quietly, persistently.
By now, Calcutta has been established as a city of contrasts, opulent elites and struggling masses, palaces and clogged drains, leisure and disease. But cholera, of course, didn't respect city boundaries. It had bigger plans. And it turns out the world was listening, or at least noticing and trying to figure out what to do in that slow British bureaucracy kind of way. From Calcutta to the world. If part 4 was a gentle float down the Hooghly, part 8 is a slow drift across oceans. Cholera began leaving Calcutta in the 1820s, hitching rides on ships, pilgrims, and trade caravans. By the 1830s and 1840s, outbreaks had reached the Middle East, Russia, Europe, and North America. Imagine the headlines if newspapers looked the same back then. Asiatic cholera arrives in London, beware of the Ganges. Or Calcutta's gift to the West, a disease without borders. Of course, Calcutta's fault was a convenient narrative. European elites liked to blame distant lands rather than examine their own shipping practices, military movements, or urban neglect. It was easier to declare cholera an oriental disease than admit that global trade and empire made it possible. The science shuffle. Meanwhile, in drawing rooms and lecture halls far from banal, scientists and doctors began debating the cause. The main contenders were miasma theory, bad air, foul smells, corrupt vapors, classic Victorian thinking, smelly streets, obvious culprit. Contagion theory, close contact spreads disease, but it's still vague. You can catch it from someone, or maybe their clothes, maybe the air, maybe a handshake. Waterborne hypothesis. A small but growing number of thinkers suspected that contaminated water caused cholera. Observations in Calcutta and other cities hinted at it, but acknowledging this required real infrastructure reform, which governments were hesitant to fund. These debates dragged on for decades, fueled by ego, colonial bias, and slow communication. Doctors in London and Paris argued with their colleagues in Calcutta over letters and journals, each convinced their theory was correct, all while people continued to die quietly along the Hooghly. Ships as vectors. Shipping, of course, was a key factor. Goods, passengers, and cholera bacteria all shared the same space. Crates of opium sailed to Canton. Sailors carried microbes across oceans. Europe and North America became unwitting hosts to a disease that had started in India centuries before. Quarantine measures were attempted sporadically, but often too late or half-hearted. Ships were held in harbor, passengers examined, cargo fumigated, but by then, germs had already slipped through unnoticed. The slow, bureaucratic pace meant that cholera often arrived before anyone could stop it. Public health infrastructure begins, sort of. In response, slowly and very cautiously, governments began investing in sanitation. In Calcutta, new drains were dug, water tanks were cleaned, street sweeping was introduced more systematically. Certain markets and slaughterhouses were relocated. Progress was incremental. Some projects were symbolic, meant to impress visiting officials or reduce the appearance of chaos. Others genuinely improved conditions, though the city's size and complexity meant change was glacial. Hospitals and data collection. Hospitals began keeping more meticulous records, creating rudimentary epidemiological maps. Physicians charted cases by neighborhood, water source, and social class. They began to notice patterns. Cholera wasn't random. It clustered. Drinking contaminated water correlated with outbreaks. Pilgrimages and troop movements often accelerated spread. These observations were early building blocks of modern epidemiology. Slowly, science began to catch up to experience, though bureaucracies and social prejudices slowed implementation. Colonial attitudes and misunderstandings. It's worth noting that colonial authorities often interpreted data through a biased lens. If cholera struck the poor, it was their fault for living in slums. If it struck Europeans, it was mysterious, tragic, and worthy of urgent attention. Reports consistently reflected a hierarchy of concern. And yet, even with bias, these records provide historians with invaluable insight into how cholera spread, how people adapted, and how early modern medicine began to grapple with urban epidemics. International conferences and knowledge sharing. By the mid-19th century, cholera had become a global phenomenon, prompting the first international health conferences. European and American doctors met to discuss quarantine, sanitation, and prevention. Maps were drawn, theories debated, recommendations issued.
Most of these recommendations were ignored at first or only partially implemented, but the process marked the beginning of an international understanding of epidemic disease. Calcutta quietly was central to this narrative. The city's disease didn't just kill locally, it shaped global thinking about hygiene, public health, and urban planning. Everyday life amid global threats. Back in Calcutta, ordinary people didn't read international journals or attend conferences. They responded to cholera in practical ways, avoiding certain streets, fetching water from safer tanks, performing rituals, and sharing advice within their social networks. The elites continued to invest in comfort and distraction, confident that wealth and status provided protection. And sometimes it did, but never perfectly. Cholera did not discriminate entirely, though it had clear preferences based on access to clean water, nutrition, and space. A slow, quiet legacy. By the late 19th century, the combination of public health reforms, hospitals, and improved sanitation began to reduce cholera's death toll. Epidemics continued, but they were less catastrophic than before. Calcutta's role remained complex. The city had been a source of disease, a laboratory for colonial medicine, and a hub of global trade. Its dual legacy, opium profits and cholera devastation, remained intertwined. The city's experience influenced public health not just locally, but globally. Gentle reflection. Picture the Hooghly at dusk. Ships drift lazily toward the horizon. The air is humid but carries a faint smell of flowers from gardens lining Chowringhee. Children play quietly in alleys, aware of danger but still finding small joy. Hospitals hum softly in the distance. Lamps flicker in homes where families whisper prayers, carry herbs, and share advice. Science debates quietly in the background, slowly piecing together knowledge. Infrastructure improves, a bit at a time, and cholera, persistent and invisible, begins to lose its absolute power, not because it disappears, but because humans slowly learn to navigate the risks. Calcutta remains a city of contrasts, slowly evolving, a hub of trade, disease, and tentative progress. And as always, life moves quietly, persistently, inexorably forward.
By the late 19th century, Calcutta had been living with cholera for decades. Ships carried disease across oceans, neighborhoods alternated between wealth and squalor, and opium profits continued to flow. But slowly, almost reluctantly, the colonial administration and local elites began tinkering with urban reform. The gentle push for sanitation. The authorities realized something they had ignored for far too long. Clogged drains, overflowing tanks, and open sewers were bad for business. Workers got sick, taxes were lost, and cholera outbreaks embarrassed everyone. So small reforms began. Streets were cleared of garbage more systematically. Water supplies were regulated, with some tanks fenced off or relocated. Slum dwellers were nudged, gently and sometimes not so gently, to live cleaner. And yet, progress was glacial. Funds were limited, bureaucracy moved slower than a river barge. Some projects were symbolic, a new stone-lined drain here, a public bath there. They were intended to show the world that Calcutta was a modern city, but often didn't do much for actual cholera prevention. Elite reactions. European elites had mixed feelings about these reforms. Some embraced them, seeing sanitation as a way to protect their families and investments. Others grumbled, complaining that reforms were intrusive, expensive, or simply unnecessary. For the local Bengali elites, reactions were equally varied. Some collaborated, funding hospitals or helping improve water supplies. Others resisted, suspicious of colonial intentions or unwilling to change long-standing traditions. In short, urban reform became a dance of compromise, hesitation, and occasional eye-rolling, with progress always measured in slow, reluctant steps. opium and urban life. Meanwhile, opium wealth continued to shape the city. Merchants, traders, and British officials spent profits on lavish homes, clubs, gardens, and parties. The contrast between opulence and disease remained sharp. Sometimes reforms even benefited the wealthy disproportionately. Clean streets and improved water sources often prioritized areas near elite residences, leaving slums and markets still struggling with cholera outbreaks. In other words, progress was patchy, incremental, and socially stratified. Hospitals and public health expansion. Hospitals continued to grow, both in number and scope. New wards were added, some specializing in cholera treatment. Training for doctors improved, though by today's standards, it was still rudimentary. Nurses and staff became more professionalized, though pay and conditions remained poor. Public health campaigns began spreading knowledge, teaching citizens about contaminated water, hygiene, and basic preventive measures. Pamphlets were distributed, lectures were held, and officials tried to influence daily routines, though effectiveness varied depending on literacy, trust, and compliance. Coping mechanisms persist. Despite reforms, people still relied on traditional coping mechanisms, rituals, prayers, and social networks. Festivals continued, sometimes modified to reduce risk. Families monitored local water sources and shared warnings about outbreaks. Children adapted quietly, learning routines that balanced play with caution. In other words, human ingenuity remained a constant, quietly complementing or compensating for the slow bureaucratic progress. Survival was often a mix of observation, superstition, and experience. Rumors and moral panic. As reforms became more visible, new rumors circulated. Some accused officials of secretly poisoning water. Others suggested that improved sanitation was a trick to control the poor. Moral panic mingled with practical concern, creating a tense but oddly structured social response. The elite largely ignored such rumors or laughed at them behind closed doors. The poor, however, treated them with a mixture of caution, curiosity, and occasional skepticism. In this way, cholera and reform continued to shape not just infrastructure but beliefs, behaviors, and daily life. Quiet transformations. By the late 19th century, small but meaningful changes were visible. Streets in central Calcutta were cleaner. Some neighborhoods had regulated water supplies. Hospitals and clinics were slowly improving access and treatment. Public awareness of disease had grown, blending colonial advice with local knowledge. The city was not perfect, and outbreaks still occurred, but there was a gentle trajectory toward modernization. Slow, uneven, and always complicated by social hierarchies and colonial priorities. The dual legacy. Calcutta's dual legacy persisted. On one hand, it was a hub of opium wealth, commerce, and elite comfort. On the other, it was a center of disease, suffering, and persistent inequality. The late 19th century shows us how a city can struggle, adapt, and transform slowly, all while maintaining contradictions. Opulence and tragedy, reform and resistance, science and superstition, all existed simultaneously, creating a rhythm both mundane and extraordinary. Gentle reflection. Picture the city in the evening. Chandeliers glow faintly in elite homes. Lanterns flicker along narrow streets. Children whisper and play quietly in alleys. Boats drift on the Hooghly. Hospitals hum softly, nurses move between cots, doctors scribble notes. Reforms are tentative. Human behavior remains adaptive, and life continues in a slow, persistent rhythm. Calcutta, with all its contrasts, continues to breathe, survive, and evolve.
By the early 20th century, Calcutta had been living with cholera, opium trade, and colonial oversight for over a century. And yet, as with many things in life, progress arrived slowly, sometimes reluctantly, and occasionally accompanied by bureaucratic eye-rolling. Early public health advances. Scientific understanding of cholera finally caught up with decades of observation. The germ theory of disease, long debated, became widely accepted. Louis Pasteur's discoveries in Europe made waves even here. Calcutta's hospitals and health boards began recognizing that contaminated water, not miasma or angry spirits, was the main culprit. Water purification projects were introduced more systematically. Certain areas of the city received regulated piped water. Wells were tested and cleaned. Open drains were covered or rerouted. Hospitals improved hygiene, sterilizing instruments, and introducing isolation wards more consistently. These advances didn't eliminate cholera overnight, far from it, but they marked a subtle shift from reactive treatment to preventative infrastructure. Education and public awareness. Alongside infrastructure, public education became more widespread. Pamphlets, lectures, and public notices explained how cholera spread, emphasizing boiling water, hand washing, and isolation of the sick. Of course, adoption varied. Many residents continued to rely on traditional coping mechanisms, rituals, prayers, and community advice. And that was okay. Public health officials increasingly realized that blending modern science with local knowledge was more effective than trying to eradicate centuries of cultural practice. Hospitals evolve. Hospitals, meanwhile, had grown in both size and professionalism. Nurses received more formal training, wards were expanded, and record-keeping became systematic. Doctors still debated treatment methods, but at least now they understood why cholera spread and how to mitigate risk. Isolation wards became standard for patients with severe cases. Outbreak response teams were created, moving quietly through neighborhoods to monitor conditions, distribute clean water, and encourage preventative measures. It was, in short, a gradual professionalization of medicine, happening while the city continued its usual rhythm of trade, festivals, and quiet survival. The role of government. The colonial administration increasingly invested in sanitation not only for moral reasons but for practical ones. Healthy workers meant productive trade. Reduced epidemics meant less disruption to shipping and markets. Urban planning slowly reflected public health priorities. Some neighborhoods were redesigned with wider streets and better drainage. Markets and slaughterhouses were relocated to reduce contamination risks. Piped water became more common in elite and middle-class areas, while poorer neighborhoods often received delayed or partial coverage. As always, progress was uneven, but it existed. And in a city that had suffered cholera waves for decades, that was significant. Decline of cholera pandemics. By the 1920s, the combination of improved sanitation, better hospitals, public education, and scientific understanding began to reduce cholera mortality. Outbreaks continued, but they were less catastrophic than in the 19th century. Calcutta had shifted from being a city where cholera struck randomly and ruthlessly to one where human intervention could alter outcomes, even if imperfectly. This was slow, painstaking, and sometimes frustratingly inconsistent, but it worked in a subtle, quiet way. The opium legacy. Meanwhile, the opium trade, while still present, was beginning to change. International pressures, moral debates, and economic shifts reduced its dominance. The city's wealth slowly diversified, with trade in jute, tea, and other commodities gaining importance. Yet the contrast between wealth and disease remained visible.
Grand houses, clubs, and gardens continued to coexist with dense neighborhoods, narrow alleys, and crowded markets. The city's duality persisted even as its public health situation improved. Cultural and social adaptation. Calcutta's residents had also adapted culturally. Families had incorporated preventative measures into daily routines. Festivals and rituals continued, but now sometimes included hygienic practices. Children learned safe water habits, adults adjusted cooking routines, and social networks continued to provide informal support. In other words, the city's population had quietly learned to live with disease without being entirely defined by it. This was perhaps the most important adaptation of all, a cultural resilience shaped by decades of experience. A slowly modernizing metropolis. By the 1930s, Calcutta had begun to resemble a modern metropolis. Piped water in many areas, improved sanitation and cleaner streets, hospitals capable of handling epidemics more effectively, public health campaigns integrated into daily life, a more professional medical community aware of disease patterns. Yet, the city never lost its contrasts. Wealth and poverty, opulence and survival, tradition and modernity all existed side by side. Cholera no longer ruled the city, but its memory lingered in the cautious routines, the infrastructure, and the persistent awareness of risk. Gentle reflection. Picture the city in the early 20th century. The Hooghly glimmers under a calm evening sky. Boats drift lazily, carrying goods and people. Children play quietly in alleys, now slightly safer thanks to cleaner water. Hospitals hum softly in the background, nurses and doctors moving efficiently. Lanterns and street lights illuminate streets where commerce and ritual continue side by side. Calcutta slowly is learning to breathe more safely. Disease has lost some of its omnipotence. Progress is incremental, patchy, sometimes frustrating, but undeniable. And life, as always, continues, quietly, persistently, in that same rhythm of contrasts that has defined the city for over a century. And that, my friends, is where we gently leave part 10.